Okay, let's start talking about professionalism again. Alright, 2.3. This one is probably one of the mantras of interpreting, and that is render the message faithfully. Render it faithfully, render it faithfully, render it faithfully. And not just that, but by conveying the content and the spirit of what is being communicated, okay? Using the language most readily understood by the consumers and correcting your errors discreetly and expeditiously. So let's break that down for a second, okay? Render the message faithfully. That means, again, like I was speaking of before, you can't include your biases. You can't include, like in my case, I would call them layolisms, okay? For example, when I'm interpreting for somebody and they use this sign that they need to go to the bathroom, I don't say, I need to go potty, because that's what I would say, okay? I need to go potty. I know that that's not what other people say, and so henceforth I can't add in that layolism, okay? Also conveying the content and spirit of what's being communicated. If somebody is so excited and signing and they're just, you know, really emotive, and you're like, and tomorrow we're going to Disney World, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. That is not the spirit. It may be the content of what was being said, but it's not the spirit of what's being said if you sound like the dry eyes guy. Okay? Also using the language most readily understood by consumers. When you're in the ITP, and you guys who are in the ASL classes know this, when you're going, I was a student myself, I went through the interpreter training program, and so I'm feeling you. When you go through the classes, your teachers are like, ASL or deaf, you know, and that's just what they teach you. And what's funny is when you get out into the deaf community, you realize it's not always like that. Not everybody wants ASL, and that's okay. You know, it's not my decision. It's not my job to judge. I use whatever they prefer me to use. If they want me to mouth all the words, then I mouth all the words. If they want me to not mouth all the words and just use signs, then I do that. If they want me to try to use their signs instead of the ones that I already know, then I try to incorporate that as much as possible. It's not like, I'm doing ASL and you're gonna like it! You know what I mean? It's just whatever they prefer, I try to do that. In situations like what I'm about to have to do with making a video in sign language, I'm going to probably do a hodgepodge of a few different things because I don't know who's going to be watching the video necessarily, and so henceforth I just kind of have to try to match the audience as best as possible. But you don't always know your audience. Again, knowing your audience, how do you know your audience? You get there early. With a video you can't necessarily do that, but as much as possible I try to arrive to assignments early to listen to both the English speaker and the ASL user, or sign language user I should say, just to make sure that I'm matching both of their needs as much as I possibly can. And then correcting errors discreetly and expeditiously. I used to live in Mexico, and so I learned a lot of my Spanish there. And I have a friend who, he learned most of his Spanish in classes in the United States. And so his grammar is wonderful, but because his grammar is so good, he hears his own mistakes so often that he's constantly correcting them. And his accent kind of sucks too. But anyway, you know, he'll say, lo siento, which means I'm sorry, you know, and he's constantly correcting himself. And so it's important to correct yourself. If you know that you've made a mistake, it's important to correct yourself, but you need to do it where it's unobtrusive, you know. Just back up and say, okay, blah, 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 whatever it was that you were supposed to say, whether it's in English or in sign language. And what I will say is that if I'm the one who's making the mistake, I always want to make sure that I put that mistake on me and not the consumer, whether it be the hearing or the deaf consumer. Either way, I want to make sure that both consumers know that I'm the one who made the mistake, not them. Because that sometimes can jade their opinion of the other person. Don't want that to happen. 2.4 speaks on requesting support. And you know what's funny is, honestly, graduates of the ITP, I see you guys doing this pretty well. It's usually people who are seasoned interpreters, people who have been out there for a while, who it's like they don't want to admit that they need help. I don't know, it's kind of like an addiction, right? They don't want to admit that they need help, but there's nothing wrong with admitting that you don't know everything, because if you think you do, you're wrong. And so it's important to request any kind of support that you need, whether it's certified deaf interpreters, a team interpreter, anything like that. It's really important that you request that as needed. Anything that you think is going to help you to get your message across to the other person. And so you also need to learn to advocate for that for yourself, whatever the need may be. Especially, suppose that I'm in a courtroom and the deaf person who I'm interpreting with, now I personally don't have court certification, but suppose I did, and I was interpreting, and I realized that this person had emerging language skill, or meaning that maybe both their English and their sign language was just so-so. It doesn't reflect upon their intelligence. They may be extremely intelligent, but they just don't have language to convey that. Henceforth, I may need to bring in a CDI, or someone who can gesture to them better than I probably could, honestly, to make sure that we're effectively communicating that information. That's this person's life. If it's a court case, you know, I mean, I want to make sure that they fully understand what's happening to them, as well as I want to make sure that the court understands what they're saying. So it would be important to request additional services in that situation. 2.5 talks about refraining from providing counsel, advice, or personal opinions. I see interpreters do this all the time, like, oh, you shouldn't be dating him, you should, oh, I'm like, shut up! It's none of your business. It's none of your business. They can make decisions, whether it's the deaf or the hearing person, doesn't matter, they can make decisions without your input. This becomes very difficult when I have some friends who are both counselors and they're interpreters, and that becomes a very sticky situation. Or, you know, if you work in a school, you're a school interpreter, guess what? You may be the only person in that deaf student's life, especially if you're a mainstream interpreter, who ever gets to talk to them. Maybe mom and dad, and 99% of the time, well, I shouldn't say 99% of the time, but a lot of the time, mom and dad don't sign. And so they come to school, you're the only person who they can talk to. Guess who they're going to want to talk to about sex, about their relationships, about their period, about erections, about all kinds of things that are going on with them because they don't know what's happening to them. And they're going to come talk to you. And so it's important that we draw the line at counseling. I do feel it's important to sometimes give some base knowledge that I feel like is just something that all hearing people would know, so henceforth it's fair that the deaf person knows that information too. But you really need to feel out each situation to ensure that you're not counseling the person. Something else though, however, 2.6 says judiciously provide information or referral regarding available interpreting or community resources without infringing upon the consumer's rights. And so it talks about, again, in the guiding principle, that we need to be aware of deafness-related resources. And so it is important that we still know about that to provide that. For example, I was working in an AA class. It was all hearing students with hearing participants and one deaf participant. And the deaf participant and the hearing counselor were just at a loss. You know, the deaf person was like, I want to be around other deaf people who understand where I'm coming from, both with my addiction and with being deaf. And the counselor kept saying, I don't know, I've searched around, I can't find any deaf groups. My team interpreter, my colleague, looked at me and said, please don't rat me out. And she looked at both the counselor and the deaf person and said, I know there's a church in the area where there's a deaf group that meets for rehabilitation. I can give you the phone number and the address as to where that's located. And I kind of looked at her and I was like, what was wrong with that information? That's a deafness-related resource. She wasn't telling them, you need to go to do this. Nothing like that. She just said, here's the information. Later I found out she felt badly about it because it was her church. But even still, she never said that. All she said was, here's the information. If you want it, here it is. And I think that that's a deafness-related resource. So you do need to be careful in drawing a line between that. Sometimes it's going to be a gray area. And you know what? All of us make mistakes. I still make mistakes where I go back and think I should have done more or I should have done less. But you just need to judge each situation and learn from the mistakes you make. Alright, next we're going to be talking about conduct. Thanks.